I'd now like to introduce the moderator for this session, who is Joe Klimavicz. He's the CIO and Director of High Performance Computing and Communications at NOAA. So I will turn the time over to him.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you very much for attending the Federal Shared Services Roundtable. I really appreciate everybody hanging in there through lunch, and we'll try to make this entertaining and certainly worthwhile. I am Joe Klimavicz, NOAA CIO, but also co-chair of the Shared Services Subcommittee. And we had a great team last year working on shared services, really across the different departments. It was really a team effort, and the shared services catalog demo you just saw really took a huge team effort, not only within the departments but also with OMB. So we have a great group here today of government leaders to talk about their experience with shared services. And given decreasing IT budgets, expanding performance requirements, and certainly rising customer expectations, federal agencies really need to figure out how to do more with less. And this is possible, I believe, with shared services. Shared IT services provide a powerful approach to reducing cost, increasing quality, productivity, and quickly delivering new capabilities. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, explain their role in shared services, and maybe identify what shared services their particular group offers, and maybe describe the business model, because I think we've got a very diverse group in terms of different business models, different services, and I think it'll be an interesting contrast. Thank you. Mike,
Sure. Does everybody hear me okay? I'm Mike Casella. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at GSA. Relatively new to that agency, came over in March from being Budget Director at USAID. Previously was acting CFO at a small agency called the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So I've been on both sides of shared services, a customer now as well as now a provider. And previously spent a long time at OMB in a few different capacities. So I'm still learning our business model, to be very honest, and I don't get to use that excuse for too much longer now that I've been there about 6 months, but I may still use it once or twice during this discussion. But basically, we're a full-service provider. We tend to cater to smaller agencies, ranging from top of, I think, one agency of a few thousand, down to presidential commissions, which literally have 2 employees. Therefore, with a couple of exceptions, which I'll mention, we tend to do the full gamut. We provide HR, we do all 3 lines of business: HR, payroll, and financial management. And we tend to provide full service, both platform and services, across those 3 areas. There are a few exceptions where we're providing, I think, 1 or 2 agencies who are doing their own financials, and we're just providing the platform, and 1 or 2 that have their own platforms, and we're doing some of the servicing. And then we have at least 1 niche market, which we're, I think, maybe the only provider on, which is childcare services, the financials for childcare services, where we have clients like Coast Guard, for example, which have otherwise do their own business, but have bought into us for that 1 niche area.
Jerry. Good afternoon. I'm Jerry Johnston. I'm the Geospatial Information Officer at the Department of the Interior. I'm here today in my role. DOI is the managing partner for a relatively new line of business called the Geospatial line of business and the Geospatial Shared Services Initiative. And I say it's new in that we're at a real change point in terms of where we've been. So the geospatial community in the federal government has had a long-standing collaboration through an organization called the Federal Geographic Data Committee that was founded in 1990 and is comprised now of senior agency officials for geospatial information from 32 different departments across the government. We've worked for a long time collaborating on standards and policies, working to move the geospatial technology in our country really forward across not just the federal agencies, but our network of partners outside the federal government, and certainly with our state and local government partners. One of the things that's happened in recent years through these discussions is the strong desire for a move, not to step away from the policy and standard setting, but really to also embrace looking at shared infrastructure and looking at how these agencies can come together, use this existing collaborative structure and frankly the relationships and the goodwill that we've built amongst each other for a long time, and start to offer operational IT services. So we've taken the geospatial line of business structure and are in the process of revamping that to be a geospatial shared services initiative, and Joe's been a real leader in that space. And it was really some of his work on Deepwater Horizon a couple of years ago where NOAA took a major lead and stood up the first federal-wide map for one major incident that we had with regards to Deepwater. And we've been kind of taking the next steps from there and really taking what Joe and NOAA did and making it operational and turning it into a program that can be used by many. I'll close by saying that one of the things, so geospatial is a very, very broad area. Geospatial technology is used across most of the civilian agencies, all of the defense and intel components, and used in many, many different mission areas, natural resources management, military lands management, policy, facilities, many other things. What we're really trying to do from a shared services perspective is to focus on the 80%. So what's the core of what we can offer that brings value back to our member agencies in the FGDC and then more broadly to our other partners. And a lot of that is about commodity hosting services that are tailored for geospatial needs. So geospatial data hosting, geospatial application hosting and development. And we're starting to do some of that through an initiative called the Geospatial Platform that I'll talk about more as we move on. Josh?
Hi, and my name is Josh Spicka. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. I am the PMO for the Information System Security line of business. Basically, the realm that we operate in is everything for information system security. Like many federal acronyms, it's pretty straightforward about what we do. We cover primarily 2 or 3 different areas. Security awareness training is a big one for us. We cover both general security awareness training and Tier 2 security awareness training. And we also have shared service centers for authorization and accreditation services as well. While we do not have a table out front, we do have people here presenting about those things if you have questions about it in the future. Mr. Rodney Sloan in the back is here to talk about ANA services, and if you have not yet met Mr. Mike Riley, you should meet Mr. Mike Riley. He's one of our great supporters. He's a great guy. If you have a chance to talk with him, you should. We also cover things involving blanket purchase agreements. So we have blanket purchase agreements for security awareness and incident response tools, risk management framework tools, and for those of you who are paying attention to the continuous diagnostics and mitigation, continuous monitoring as a service tools, it's my understanding that now that the BPA has been awarded for CMAS, that we'll be taking on some role for that as well. Over the course of the last couple of, I've been operating this for about 3 years. And we've put a lot of great services in place to cover those realms. We are looking at other options, possibly even an MTIP shared service center to assist smaller departments and agencies in getting MTIP services as well.
So Joe Ward, Department of the Interior, Director of the Interior Business Center, formerly known as the National Business Center. We're a federal shared service provider. We support the department as well as about 150 different federal agencies. We primarily have 3 major lines of business with 2 support units. The 3 major lines of business are human resources, financial management, and acquisition. And we provide a full suite of services across the spectrum in those 3. In terms of our business model, we're a fee-for-service working capital fund operation, a mix of contractors and feds, about 400 or so contractors, about 1,000 or so FTEs. We also have a limited franchise fund authority, and we've been in a shared service business in some form or fashion by various names since about the 1980s.
Okay, thanks for the introductions. I've got several questions here that I'm going to ask the distinguished panel, but I would ask that you think about questions you might want to ask because we will have time, I'm pretty sure, at the end for questions from the audience. So let me kick it off with significant challenges exist with the adoption of broader use of shared services. Some of these challenges are in the budget area, some are in the acquisition area, governance, user readiness, provider readiness, are some of the more frequently mentioned challenges. And Mike, let's start off with you, but can you speak to your experiences with budget and acquisition challenges? And then what budgeting models and fund transfer processes you think are most effective?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Again, I think everybody can hear me. There we go. I have been on both sides of the equation. In some ways, probably have stronger views from my time as a consumer, actually, with IBC when it was NBC. I will say a couple things. One is the franchise fund authority is, I think, critical. I think if providers don't have the ability, if providers have to charge for every dime they invest, when they invest it, it's going to be it makes it very hard for agencies who are customers for a number of reasons. One is that your bills are unpredictable during the year. If you have to do an upgrade that happens on a different time frame than you predicted, and agencies have to cough up in that year, it becomes extremely difficult for them. I think it's critical to have that. I think the other huge budget barrier I see is migration. I will tell you, there are a number of agencies, we were one of them, that looked at, do we look at other options? Do we stay? Do we go? And at the end of the day, we stayed in part because NBC provided some additional service we wanted, and in part because we couldn't afford to move even if we had wanted to. And that, I think, is what a lot of agencies face in this budget climate. It's easy to say, well, you should pick the best option, but the best option may not be a possible option. The only option you may be able to afford in any given time frame is to stick with what you're doing. And if you're with a service provider, work with that provider, whether you want, that's where you want to end up or not. And if you're not, I think it's even harder because there are a lot of agencies out there. I mean, there are a lot of agencies who don't want to move, and I think this is worth the discussion because they just don't feel like moving, and that's obviously not a good enough reason. Again, having been on both sides of this, I'm a big believer in the FIT model, where you provide agencies flexibility on the services they buy, but you force them to move to a small number of platforms. I mean, there's no way having the multiple platforms we have in financial management right now is efficient. I don't think anyone can make an efficiency argument for it. It comes down to two barriers. One is cultural. I want to control everything I do. And the other is money. And money is a real barrier right now. The capital costs of not just standing up the lines of business, but moving to one are huge. So I would say, I don't think acquisition is a huge barrier. And in fact, it's a heck of a lot easier to go to a federal provider than it is to go to a private solution in terms of acquisition. You don't have protests. You don't have, the rules are much more flexible. The amount of time your general counsel has to spend on it is much lower. So I think acquisition is all on the positive side when you're looking at federal providers. I think budget is a huge barrier. And I would throw out there that if OMB and Treasury, and that's really at the end of the day has to be OMB, are serious about pushing agencies to get to the point on financial management where they're pretty close to being now on HR and particularly on payroll, where you really are going to have, in another couple of years, 3 or 4 providers for each, and virtually everyone's going to be on one of those providers. We're nowhere near that on financial management. If you want to get there, I think OMB has to look at a model that helps agencies pay the costs of getting there. At GSA, we actually have been experimenting with this on consolidation, where we're trying to convince agencies to shrink their footprints, particularly to move out of lease space and into own space, where the government already has a sunk cost. And we are providing, we are offering in many cases to help subsidize moves, to subsidize furniture purchases. We have a new product where this doesn't actually subsidize, but it allows agencies to, in effect, lease to own furniture and IT, so they can pay it over 3 to 5 year period, depending on the useful life of the furniture or the IT products, rather than having to find to come up with the capital up front to invest. And I think unless OMB is willing to start looking at models like that, it's going to be very hard to get agencies to do what Treasury, I think, is sensibly proposing.
Okay. Thank you. Jerry, maybe you can talk a little bit about governance challenges.
Sure. No, thanks, Joe. I'll talk about that in the context of what we're trying to do right this minute. And I guess in addition to challenges, I'd like to share some areas where I think we've been successful as well. So I mentioned briefly in my introductory remarks that one of the activities that we're working on right now is a program called the Geospatial Platform. And what we've been able to do so far, and we're beginning to offer more and more services through this technology base. We've partnered with data.gov. We're working on having, for those who know some of the metadata catalogs across government, there have always been many. There's a geospatial catalog over here and data.gov here. We finally, over the summer, have brought everything together, working in partnership with data.gov. We've got a single catalog that we're offering to all of our members and our state partners who provide a lot of this data. We've started to build communities of interest and communities of practice into our website, where our partners can come in and build their little corner of this website and kind of share information with their peers and so on. And then I mentioned that the really big offering that we're getting ready to embark upon is shared geospatial data and application hosting. And that's really where the governance comes in for us, is for the services that are truly new. This is new territory for an existing governance structure that's worked together for 20, 25 years in this area already, the Federal Geographic Data Committee. And I'd like to reflect on what Mike said. I think we have to recognize that there are big transition costs, there are startup costs for many of these things we want to do. And in the case of what we're trying to do with the Geospatial Shared Services Initiative, before I feel comfortable going out and selling an offering, we need to have an offering. And it takes us startup funding to get that going. I have to say that in our case, one of our governance successes, though, has been that we were very lucky in working with OMB, frankly, as they serve as the vice chair of the Federal Geographic Data Committee, to take money that the agencies were already investing in the geospatial line of business activity, which was about policies and standards and frameworks, and to allow us to repurpose some of that money to make that initial investment to start to build services. So that's really where we're at right now, is taking the initial investment that the agencies have made and are working to bring that forward, so that entering into 14, that we have a series of services that we can begin to build upon. So our funding model, I didn't mention this in my introductory remarks, from a business standpoint, we expect to continue to have a bill at the beginning of the year that the FGDC members will pay for some hopefully small amount of money across each department that kind of provides the core program management office and some basic functionalities that are for the good of everybody across government. And then in addition to that, we'll be offering a menu of services that people can buy on top of that. But with regards to challenges, I think our biggest challenge, well, we have two major challenges. One is that we're trying to adopt a long-standing existing governance structure to do what we want to do today. So I mentioned this is a 20-plus-year-old governance body. It was set up to create policies and standards and to, frankly, be bureaucratic and spend a long, 10 months, 12 months going through different processes. IT shared services don't work that way. We need to be nimble. We need to be able to act quickly and move on. So we've begun to revamp the governance structure of the FGDC in response to that, but it takes a long time to move in an enterprise that's been around for that long. I guess our second challenge, and I don't think this is unique to ours, but I haven't talked to other shared service providers about this, is that one of the things that we're trying to do is to create a national shared service offering. So we've got other government partners, NGOs, and many people that are involved in this community that have been partners with the Federal Geographic Data community for a long time, are also interested in using these shared services. So one of the challenges that we have from a governance standpoint is creating really meaningful and effective governance structures that are inclusive of bodies outside the federal government. We have a FACA that helps, but they can only provide us advice. They can't really sit down and operationally help us manage some of this shared infrastructure that we're putting together. So that's one of our biggest challenges right now.
So Josh, maybe you can talk a little bit about how user and provider readiness has affected your ability to deliver services.
Absolutely, thank you. From the provider side, there's not that many challenges. With the ISSLOB, we have a very set organization. We say this is what we can provide, this is what we have, and we're ready to do it. So there's not a whole lot of challenge on that end for us. But on the user side, it is very difficult. I like to eat, I'm not going to lie, and I'm glad to see that some of you join me in that. And to that end, I also like to cook. So when I'm out cooking and the game's on and someone comes up to me and says, hey, I'll take care of those burgers for you, like, I don't want to give control away. And I find that's very similar to how I deal with the people I talk to about shared services. A lot of people are like, we'd like to move to shared services. We'd like to come and work with you, but we're concerned. We don't want to, we want our burgers medium rare. I know how I like my burger. And so we have a great deal of challenge in convincing them that we can get them what they need, what they want in their area. To that end, we've been very fortunate to some degree, and that we can, first off, we can go back and address that challenge, both in saying, well, this is the work we've done, this is how long we've been doing it, this is the results, these are the people that we've worked with in the past. Feel free to work with them, talk with them, see if the work that we've done there is what you need. If they were satisfied, will you be satisfied? We've also been very fortunate in having Mr. Klimavicz, having Mr. Larson, Mr. Bernard, and the rest of the Shared Services Subcommittee and Executive Steering Board, put other things into place like Uncle Sam's List, et cetera, that gives them a little more confidence that this is not like a fly-by-night organization and we did not just stand up this line of business here and that we're just trying to do some work. So from that end, the user readiness is really an issue for us. Getting people to come to the table, take a look at what we have, and say, okay, yes, this is something that we can work with. Of course, the other issue that kind of pushes them, nudges them to us is as budgets get tighter. As mentioned, that will also help. But the user issues are very critical for us.
So Joe, you got a lot of experience in this area. Which one of these challenge areas do you think represents the greatest challenge?
I think that's an excellent question. All of the above. So in addition to that, something that has not been mentioned is the organizational change management piece. Josh referred to it a little bit at the end of his comments, but if you don't get the organizational change management piece straight, and we had a person in the last session, Sherry, mentioned that, then you're going to have a really uphill battle, because when it comes to people, and people make things happen, people need to know what the desired end state looks like. People need to know what's at the end of the tunnel, and they need to know specifically how it impacts them. So if you're going to transform an organization and transition them to a shared service provider, they need to know what that looks like. And if it looks like that their positions might be outsourced, then you need to tell them that up front, okay? This whole idea of transparency, I think, is critically important. And I'll use a good example. I don't know how many DOD people are in the audience, but 20 or so odd years ago, I was on the receiving end of a transformation called the Consolidation of the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. At the time, I was a uniformed officer in the Air Force. I was accounting and finance officer at a base in New Mexico. Had about 120 people that reported to me. And DFAS came up with this great idea and said, tomorrow you're going to have an office half the size that you do now, and the person that happens to be your deputy will be in charge of this accounting office. Go have a great day. And of course, my reaction to that was not what they expected. So I resisted that change, as many of my counterparts in the Air Force did at the time. But the reality is, and I must say, DFAS did a really good job of describing the desired end state. They told me what my office would look like afterwards. They gave me a very good idea of what this accounting operation office would look like. They gave me a good idea of the footprint that would be reduced on the accounting side of the house as a result of this consolidation, but I resisted it anyway. And generally speaking, they had a pretty good organizational change management plan, okay? So I guess my point is, even when you do that, you're still going to get resistance. But if you don't do that, you're going to get even more. And I do want to circle back and close, because we really only have 2 to 3 minutes here, so I don't want to hog the time based on our previous agreements. There is an urban myth that if you're with a shared service provider and you don't like the service that you're receiving for whatever reason, that you're stuck. I must say that is an urban myth because there's a major cabinet level agency that was getting service from a different shared service provider, not in this room, and they will be migrating to the Business Center in 14, as well as others. So you can, if you don't like the service from one service provider, you can't switch.
Okay, thank you. Josh, let me hit you with the next question. We've heard a lot of different business models, but how important is standardization, the pursuit of standardization between the different service providers to really maximize the economies of scale?
Okay. Yeah, standardization, as I'm sure you can guess, is fairly critical. The way the information system security line of business is set up is we go out and we designate shared service centers to do work for us. So in doing so, what we do, we look at what they're doing, how they're going to do it, make sure that they can get business, make sure they're going to meet the standards that are required of them, NIST, et cetera. To give an example, if I were to try and sell you a widget and everyone's, the standard widget spins, then obviously our widget better spin or you're not going to come buy widgets from us. No, who wants one that doesn't spin? Obviously, we'll try to add some value to that, maybe get some flashy lights and some sounds. But the important part is that it meets what the user needs. And standards are definitely a key in getting that, both in terms of the work that they will perform, but also as well as the tools in which they employ. So as you go through and you look at the standards that are involved, we have both for security awareness training and authorization and accreditation. You have two different types of standards. One deals more with things like learning management systems, as well as, so you have a technical aspect, but you've also got the aspect of what information are you providing. So there's also a non-technical aspect. And by meeting those expectations of the user, then we can obviously get more people coming to those shared service centers. And thus, because more people are coming, as they go out, they try and talk to the vendor that they use, vendor or vendors that they use to provide those services, then obviously they can use that to leverage the economies of scale to drive the price down. And in doing so, they can then pass those savings on to their users. So standards for us are something that we pay a lot of attention to. Get things moving.
Thank you. All right, so Mike, get the next question and start getting to the hard ones. So what are some of the best techniques, best ways to convince both users and providers that moving to shared services is in their best interest?
Well, again, I can answer this as much as a former customer as a current provider. I think the single best way is to actually make it in their best interest. And I think the shared service providers are doing that, but we can all probably do more. I think it gets back to a few pieces. And one of these actually was an interesting discussion I've been sitting in because my boss, Dan Tangerlini, is the co-chair of the new President's Management Agenda Group on efficiency, government efficiency. And one of the lead recommendations I think that folks are looking at there is increasing the use of shared service providers and maybe going even an order of magnitude beyond where we are now, looking a little more outside the box in the types of services and even for a little more centralization or consistency in how we provide it. But one of the big issues that came up there were standards. I think it is important to have some base common standards, performance, shared performance metrics. I think the service providers actually do a pretty good job of measuring performance and being able to describe what they're able to do. I think perhaps having greater consistency in the expectations is important, so that, to some extent, agencies should not have to, in my view, should not have to choose among providers based on whether they can provide the basic services well or not. It should really be what menu do you want to be able to choose from? And there, I would say it makes a lot more sense. Again, I actually am not saying this because I used to work with Adam Goldberg or anything, I don't be, but I really do like the Treasury model because it says what I think they're trying to do is to say The base platforms will have to meet some fairly strict criteria. If you want to be a shared service provider for your on the core services, which is really the platform itself, we're going to be pretty strict on what we expect from you. But then we're going to let you be entrepreneurial in what other types of services you provide. And I think that's a good model, because it gives agencies some certainty that they're not going to have to struggle to get basic service, but also gives them flexibility to say, do I want to do my own payables and receivables or not? Do I want to do my own financials or not? Or, in the case of GSA, do we want to offer something like childcare, which is, about as niche as you can get in the market, but from what we're seeing is engendering some real interest from agencies. So I think that's a really good model. I would go back to two other points. One is the cultural one. I think to some extent you can't make it all about convincing agencies. You also have to give them some basic top-down expectations. There will always be a tendency. I love the burger analogy. There's always going to be a tendency. I want to cook my own burgers too, but I also know intellectually that there are people out there who are better at cooking burgers than I am. Doesn't mean I deep down don't want to still cook my own burgers, but it makes no sense. So I think that is literally a human nature thing, and at some point, the White House and the executive branch have to get serious about deciding where are they going to just take choice away. We're one government, and that's a legitimate way of moving people onto shared services. The other is, again, taking away the excuses. One I talked about is take away arguments about service by being clear on what your standards are. Take away the argument about, well, I can't do this or I can't do that, by having a model that says, if the shared service provider can't do it, we're going to let you do it for yourself, at least up to a point. And I think the third is, again, going back to budget. If you really want people to take it seriously, take away their budget argument. Come up with a model that actually makes it easier for agencies to do it, and then tell them to do it. Tell them they have to do it. So I don't know if that fully answered the question, but.
Thanks. That's a good lead into my next question. Joe, let me give this one to you, but what are some of the most effective techniques for monitoring and enforcing consistent quality across all facets of your shared service, and how do you measure success of your service?
So within the Business Center, what we do, and I'm not sure that this is unique to my competitors in the shared service space, but I think we do a fairly good job in the Business Center, is we have key performance indicators that we look at monthly, and we have recurring monthly dialogues where we discuss those key performance indicators. Then we have quarterly program reviews, which are a larger scale look at a larger set of key performance indicators. In addition to that, we have an annual strategic planning session. In fact, we just concluded our annual strategic planning session where we take a look back at what worked in 2013 and what didn't work so well in terms of lessons learned, and we take a look forward to see what sort of changes we need to make and what sort of tweaks we need to make to our strategy-focused organization as we look forward. And so everything that we do within the Business Center, it falls in the 4 strategic perspectives. So we have a customer perspective, we have a financial perspective, we have a learning and growth perspective, and we have an internal process perspective. And so during the annual strategic planning session, what we found out was some of the key performance indicators that we had for 2013 either need to be tweaked or in some cases deleted from our portfolio of things that we looked at. And of course, the most important thing that you need to do in terms of measuring quality is talk to your customers. And so we have various customer service instruments that we use to gauge feedback, whether it's transactional-based customer surveys from our call center or real-time feedback from executives within the department or some of the agencies that we provide in terms of the quality and satisfaction of the services we provide.
So Jerry, let me ask you to imagine a perfect world How should agencies, managing partners, suppliers, customers, all work together in order to design and use shared services to the maximum extent?
I'm imagining the perfect world where White House and OMB are serving us burgers when we come looking for budget. But as far as working together, I talked in the governance discussion about kind of our experience in working across the federal agencies and then really other governments. So how is it that we can work with state and local governments, regional, tribal, municipal governments, et cetera? I think in our community we do a pretty good job of coming to the table together and setting shared requirements. I'll say that it's hard. I mean, it's a big community of people to try and bring together and convene, but you have to, in a perfect world, you're able to invest the time that it takes to build those relationships, to take and go to each other's meetings. I know travel restrictions are making some of that more and more difficult for all of us, but really to spend the time with your customers, I think is important, and to build the real community, the camaraderie among different organizations, and I think that's one thing that we've done fairly successfully on the government side in the geospatial community. But what I recognize and where our challenges lie ahead is that in years past, when our community kind of got started, the government was really initially the leader in this technology space. The Geological Survey, the Census Bureau, others pushed the envelope for what it meant to have geospatial information technology. And then along came Google and all the other companies that really started innovating, and Esri and Microsoft and OpenGeo, and all these companies now, we want to put ourselves in the position to be able to take advantage quickly of the innovations that they're creating in the market. And I think as far as bringing people together to design shared services, one of the things that we really lack for, to some extent, is the ability to bring in our private sector partners and to make this really, to get the best minds in the room to all design collaboratively. And I don't think in many cases that we are as restricted as sometimes we might act. I think there are opportunities where we can come together and do these things in forums, at conferences like this one. ACT-IAC is a great convening body to bring organizations together and have discussions like this. We use our Federal Advisory Committee to some extent in the geospatial community to do that, but it's limited to really they're lobbing advice at us and hoping that we respond to some of these things. It's not really interactive and collaborative design. I think there are things that we can do better as we go forward to get there. And one of the most important things is I think we need to be serious about our role as government in defining those shared requirements, being really clear on what those shared requirements are, and setting policy and technology standards that that are our expectations for our private sector partners to adhere to. And then let the innovation happen and use the purchasing power of all these agencies who have taken the time to set their shared requirements to drive down costs and efficiencies, and hopefully to get truly cutting-edge solutions from that. So I think a lot of that's on government to really come together and make sure that we are speaking as government and not as the collection of individual organizations that we often do.
Okay, thank you. So I have other questions, but I thought we'd stop here and just see if there are any questions from the audience. And if you ask a question in the audience, I'll make sure that you get an A for your 0.6 credits of continuing education. Do we have a question?
Thank you. I noticed on the list of shared services from Uncle Sam's list that there was Treasury had one for travel management, Interior has one for travel management, I know GSA has a travel management system. Do you guys ever come together and try to collaborate on how can we maybe share those services across government as opposed to just, or is it intentional to have competition among the government shared service providers?
So I'll take a stab at that. So I think the answer is yes. It's not a perfect model, but the answer is yes. We do have a forum, a roundtable, where the directors of the federal shared service providers meet on a recurring basis. And quite frankly, I mentioned this in the last session, there's a level of cooperation between the directors of these federal shared service providers that is, quite frankly, noteworthy. Because even though we're competitors, we happen to be good friends, and we cooperate quite a bit. So not sure if that answers the question, but we understand that's a challenge. That's just one example. There are other examples, Oracle being another. But we've had some discussions. I see some of my peers in the room here, but we're having those discussions amongst ourselves, and we've also have started those discussions with OMB and Treasury as well.
Anybody else want to comment on the question?
Yeah, I'll follow up on that really briefly as well. To your question, one of the things about competition too, both with our line of business, something that we manufacture in is having people provide different options, just because we understand that one size doesn't always fit all. We do coordinate just to make sure that we're all meeting the same standards and that we all have an idea of what the other person is doing. But we also make sure that there is that extra option involved as well. Just because, like learning management systems, they're not all the same. Different organizations will have different requirements. We try to meet them all, but we can't always meet everything, and we don't expect one group to do so. We want to make sure there's everything out there so that people can say, okay, these guys look good, but hey, you know what, they can't meet this criteria. What about this guy? Okay, he's working for me. Good stuff. So there is some of that built in, at least on our side.
The only other thing I would add to that is that, if you look at it as a crawl, walk, run approach, I mean, one of the things we really tried to do last year was try to get a place where we could aggregate all of the shared services together and then start working through some of those and then start building some metrics in terms of, and what's different. Is quality, the rigor, pricing, and so, I mean, you provide more choices too, because not everything is created equal in terms of requirements. But I think that's something we can really focus in on now that we've got the Uncle Sam's Shared Services catalog up and running. Yes,
Hi, Sherry Weir, Carney & Company. Quick question about your governance structure. You have a great, and this is for Joe, you have a great thought out organizational structure that addresses your organization. How do your end users and your customers play a role in your annual strategy setting?
Excellent question. It varies between the lines of business. And if I can speak for some of my peers in the other shared service providers, I think it varies among the shared service providers. So we have various user groups that influence our direction. We have various forums with our users. For example, we have an annual customer day for our Oracle Federal Financial customers. We have quarterly user groups with our HR customers. We have various forums with our acquisition customers. And all of that information feeds in to the type of service that we provide. So some of those mechanisms are more formal than others, but there is voice of the customer feedback that feeds into that entire process.
Other questions? Okay, let me hit you with another. You
go ahead.
Let's talk a little bit about risk. Risk is always an important part of program management. What risk do you take on as a service provider? And then how do you help users manage their risks? And I'll throw this open to the panel. Maybe Jerry, Josh, Joe.
I can go ahead, Joe. I'll go next. Go ahead.
So there's always risk. And so depending on the size of the agency that you're bringing on, there's more risk associated with a larger agency than there is, I believe, with a smaller agency, because one of the luxuries we don't have as federal shared service providers is we don't have the luxury of carrying a bench, where we sort of have people on the side waiting for business to come in. And private sector agencies tend to have that luxury. So there's the scalability question, because you have to scale up when you bring on a new customer. Now, within the business center, and everybody does it a little differently, we scale up and down with contractors to support any new business that we bring in. But we also have a cadre of certified project managers that have to oversee that work.
And I'd say in our area, we've got a lot of risk. I mean, when you're starting a new endeavor like this in a new shared service, I think it's been discussed extensively already this morning. Careful what you wish for, or really think about this before you step into it. And as Joe and a few other people in the room know, there was a lot of discussion among the agencies of the FGDC about who would take on this role that we all agreed needed to exist. And Interior is, in my opinion, the logical place, given their history and kind of their, the way that geospatial technology is in the organization. But I recognize that we've taken on risk with regards to budget planning specifically. So we are standing up new services. We're trying to forecast the cost of services a couple budget years out in a technology space that changes on a weekly basis, it seems. So we're certainly taking on risk in terms of, how it is that we plan for services. And I think we've also got risk in terms of not really being able to adequately forecast demand for some of these services. So I think if anything, what keeps me up at night right now is setting expectations and managing expectations and making sure that we can deliver, what it is that we're out there talking about and trying to build, so we can get a little bit of experience under our belts before we have a lot of comfort of adding, new services and bringing on new customers.
Mike or Josh, any thoughts in this area?
Well, again, I'm relatively new as a provider, but I will say, we're a relatively small provider, and for us, there's a risk of covering our costs. When you have a model that we have, which is full service provider to largely smaller agencies, it's pretty difficult. You certainly are not in a position, for example, to cover capital costs with that kind of model. And I think it's what is driving, some areas like payroll and HR down to a very small number of providers. Is you need a critical mass of customers to really make the model make sense. I think, again, the FM LOB is going to be a little different and more interesting in some ways because of the separation between core services and non-core services. I think there are agencies where it probably will not make sense going forward, or doesn't make sense for them certainly to get into being a core provider of financial services. It may well make sense for them to be a niche provider. And I think that then you have a different set of risks, which are much closer to the ones described, for example, in geospatial, where you may be standing up something new and you may be trying to figure out, is there a customer base out there to begin with? But the flip side is it is a flexibility that agencies can play in without having to do the investment of standing up or maintaining a core financial system or a core payroll system, which is very expensive. And basically, it's the gift that keeps on giving in terms of having to come up with money for upgrades, having to manage upgrades. I think there's a lot involved in that that mitigates against having a large number of players.
Josh, any activities in this area for you?
I was going to say off the top of my head, I think they covered pretty much everything I would have covered. Just to give a couple comments. Obviously, you're doing authorization and accreditation work. Whenever you go out and do something like that for someone's system, you are taking on some of that risk from that perspective. And granted, the department agency who are going to then use you are also taking on a little bit of risk. They're saying, hey, we trust you to do this job for us. There's that, and that's mitigated through you're just working together, communication, making sure everything's done well. But from a risk perspective on how I look at our line of business, probably the biggest risk is just, as was mentioned earlier, was the buy-in. Okay. Is in order to get this to really work, we really need to make sure that we are covering what people need, and they're coming to us to get those solutions. Otherwise, after a while, it just doesn't make sense to continue in that aspect.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question or so from the audience.
Hi, Robert McNamara with Accenture. We've been working with a lot of agencies to help them be more efficient with the budget situation. To what degree do you think that greater transparency in the amount of money that agencies have saved from moving to a shared services model, or greater transparency about the cost savings they could potentially get from moving to a shared services model could be a catalyst over the next year in getting agencies to make that transition? If
you don't mind, I'll take first jump at that. I would like to say that cost avoidance and cost savings would be a great motivator. From our line of business, we've currently put together, one of the big metrics we look at is not just how are we doing, but how much are we saving the taxpayer, so that you can then utilize those funds in other areas where you're going to need it. And I can say over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, we've done just a little over $300 million in cost avoidance. So we'd like to put that number out there and let people know, so they can say, well, okay, you've saved other departments and agencies this much money. What about me? And I think that having the numbers will help drive people to use shared service centers. The big issue we currently have with that is simply going, just because we have a good service, it's an excellent service, and it is cost avoidant. It's kind of like buying a new car. Like I've got a Jeep, I love my Jeep, it runs fantastically. It gets terrible gas mileage, I'm not gonna lie. If people come to me all the time like, why don't you get a Prius? Those things are awesome. And my friend's is pretty good. I mean, he's got like all kinds of gadgets in there that I don't got. But I look at it and I say, well, I could save X amount of money in gas every month. You're absolutely correct if I bought a Prius. The issue is then, I got to get a mortgage. I got to bring in new tools, new techniques, things like that. So that's a big concern for us is, we like to say, hey, we're doing all this cost avoidance, but how can we also show that we can do it and meet people halfway so that they don't have to go out and procure whole new sets of tools, whole new pieces, so that not only is it cost avoidant, every year in the long run, but also just the implementation side, if that helps.
I actually think that that's an area that we can do a much better job in, quite frankly. I think Kevin started off this session saying that, generally speaking, migrating to a shared service can save an agency anywhere from 10 to 50%, give or take. The challenge that we as shared service providers have is capturing that. It's a huge, huge challenge. And quite frankly, within the federal government, most agencies are appropriated fund mentalities. They aren't working capital fund fee-for-service mentalities. So when you tell them that their cost includes rent and utilities and space and salaries and all this other kind of stuff, they don't really understand that because they get appropriated funds for that. But when you do the apples-to-apples comparison, you have to include that. And so it's a huge, huge challenge for us from the shared service provider perspective.
Jerry, Mike?
Sure.
No, please go ahead.
Just one other, that brings up a corollary thought, which is it also makes a big, I think the shared service providers can certainly do a better job, but I don't think it's a big mystery either. I think any agency that's going to do an honest analysis will probably, especially if they do get good information from a shared service provider. And actually my experience as a customer, even 6 years ago, was that we got very good information from all the people who are out there. This case, we're looking at financial management, so transportation, treasury, IBC, GSA, all gave us good information. And it was very clear to us that we could save money. And we were able to save money by staying with IBC because we were able to get a few things we wanted that we hadn't had, in part because of this analysis, and that actually ended up being the cheapest option. But any of them, it was clear that compared to any other option, including at the time going private, that the federal shared service providers were the best combination of service and price. But if we hadn't already been in one of the shared service providers, that would have been that 2 to 3 year, how do we get their cost? And so I just keep coming back to that. That's, if you do a 10-year ROI, it's always going to come out, almost always going to come out positive. If you look at the first 2 or 3 years, you throw your hands up. The one other point I would make is, I think a lot of the question of how agencies react to what I think are pretty hard to dispute facts about the savings for a shared service provider depends on how they're organized. When I was at MCC, I was the acting CFO, but also the acting vice president for management. So everything was under me. So I I was responsible not just for running the financials, but for paying for them and paying for HR and running HR and paying for acquisition and running acquisition. I think when you have a model like that, you're probably more likely to get an agency that's really going to look honestly at, what can we save, as opposed to when you have, and GSA is interesting because we're not that model. We have a CFO, a CIO, Chico, all of whom report up separately to the administrator. But we have an administrator who used to be the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Management and had all of this under him. So he himself has the mentality of saying, I'm not going to stand for turf, stovepipe. I want to cook my own hamburger stuff. We're going to look at what makes the most sense as a provider and as a customer. And I think that makes a difference. If you're negotiating with someone with a narrower scope of control, it's going to be harder in an agency as opposed to if it's you have a chief operating officer or someone who really has to see the entire picture, or assistant secretary for management or something like that.
Jerry, any
I'll
quick
just
last
add one
thoughts?
really quick thing, because I know we're getting to the end of the time. I think in the geospatial space, we've been doing a better job of capturing vignettes. These little, this agency saved this amount of money from doing this. This agency saved that amount of money from doing that. And I think those can be powerful if you collect a series of those messages and you begin to build them into your talking points and use them as ways to bring other agencies on board into a shared endeavor like this. I think for us, the cost savings is a bit of a double-edged sword, and that's really what I just wanted to raise, is that you have to make sure that those comparisons are apples to apples. I mentioned in our technology space, like many others, these are tightly affiliated with mission, and what we can't have is people at senior levels saying, well, gee, isn't what you're proposing to do duplicative with what's going on in this interagency effort? Because it may or may not be. And I think one of the difficulties that we have in our space is defining what is the core, what is the commodity part of a geospatial investment. I think that's more clear for some service areas than others, and for ours, it's certainly a work in progress.
So let me just say in wrapping this up that the purpose of this panel was to provide unique insights from shared service providers on some of the challenges and some of the different aspects of shared services, both from a provider perspective, but also working with their customers or users. And I think that they've done an outstanding job, and I'd just like to thank them for serving. Thank you very much. Thank you.